So welcome to our webinar series. This particular iteration, we're going to talk about engineering teams and how to scale them. Well, not necessarily how to scale them, but how to design them for high impact. On the previous conversation, we discussed scaling your business to align to outcomes as opposed to just velocity and moving forward for the sake of moving forward. So let's look at our itinerary here. Hopefully, this will be a pretty succinct and straightforward little webinar. I want to take all of the information that I've learned over the past 9 years of building this business and also working for other companies and seeing how large companies have built their engineering organizations alongside the dysfunction and the positives. There's always some positives, right? Because we're delivering, and there's always some dysfunctions because we're not perfect. Um, but I wanted to specifically talk about designing an engineering team for executing against business impacts and not necessarily just delivering tickets, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of there are plenty of business problems where the goal is just to drain a backlog. That's totally fine. But I want to talk a little bit more on the R&D side, more on the small team, big impact approach. That is how we've ran our teams at Seven Factor. That's how I've run my teams at other companies before Seven Factor, and we've always seen good results out of these smaller teams. And we're going to talk a little bit of theory today with some Conway's Law, et cetera. And then we're also going to talk about some case studies and just some down in the weeds stuff that we've seen. And hopefully that will hopefully that will help folks out. All right. So traditional scaling grows output faster than impact. We'll talk about why that is in this webinar. We'll talk about why engineering teams stall, why and how we might want to fix that. We're going to borrow some lessons from industry leaders to upgrade our internal models. And really, if you want to know the thesis of today's conversation, it's tribes, not teams. This is a very important ideology. It's not just how you organize things, it's also how you communicate. It's how you design and build accountability structures and how our engineering teams execute against business value and interface with product, et cetera. So let's talk about in the previous conversation. You remember we had this discussion of this concept of organizational gravity and sort of how we can align our teams to scale as and meet outcomes and meet the objectives that we're looking for. So we want to talk about what happens when things sort of break down in this model, right? Misaligned measurement, where we only care about output that's overshadowing the value that our teams are bringing. Typically, in a dysfunctional organization, you'll have siloed ownership, where again, Conway's Law is the bug here. If you don't remember what Conway's Law is, it states that the organization's organizations will design software and systems that mirror the communication structure of the organization. And this is actually a bug in the case of siloed ownership. What I mean by that is if a team only builds things in a silo, they're going to build their system as a silo. And that can be a huge problem if you're looking to create a shared software ecosystem. It can cause plenty of issues with do not repeat yourself, where you'll have code and or architectural patterns that are again tucked away in the corner and no one understands them well. This defeats a lot of tribal knowledge ideas where only that team knows how to work on that system. That can be a big problem. We want to talk about how we don't want to do that. And then manager bottlenecks. Managers typically are overwhelmed in systems like this trying to route and align everything. They're not ineffective, they're just not particularly supported. And I stole this bottom piece here from directly from Atlassian because I really like it. A bias towards transparency, loosening up hierarchy, and letting your frontline staff lead initiatives helps shape new ways of working and deliver customer lifetime value. And my silly XKCD up in the upper right hand corner is referring to Goodhart's law, which is when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. And we live by that. And that's been one of the key components towards some of our departures from some of the metricing that you see that's very prominent in industry, things like story points, et cetera. But we'll dig into that a little bit more. But ultimately, when you see a dysfunctional engineering team, typically one of these pieces is usually at its center. There are other, obviously, this is not comprehensive. There are plenty of reasons that a team might not necessarily be executing at its peak. But more of the organizational and systemic problems that you find are usually in one of these sort of three lanes, right? And so let's talk about how we can design against this concept of organizational gravity, right? To counter that, engineering organizations must design around empowered teams, scalable internal systems, and clearly defined outcomes, each serving as structural safeguard against drift, misalignment, and inertia. So, what do we mean by this? We talked about when we're discussing organizational gravity. It was this thing that we talked about on the previous webinar. I'd go review that if you want a deeper dive into it. But we have teams, infrastructure, and outcomes are really the three components of how this works. And infrastructure pulls your teams towards outcomes, right? It develops a framework or a system where your teams can build business value and deliver those things into production, right? So how do we design against that? The teams typically are aligned, autonomous units with shared context. This goes again to the tribes, not teams idea. We'll talk a little bit more about that sort of as we get into that. Infrastructure is built around systems that produce internal platforms for automation, observability, and shared ownership. And then finally, our outcomes are aligned to real business impact, right? So when I talk about organizational gravity, we're talking about the tendency for teams to form around structure, tools, and incentives, even if those things are not designed for scale. This means that again, echoing Conway's law, it explains the same thing, right? Teams tend to design systems that reflect their communication paths and silos, and so these two ideas are kind of very intuitive and very coupled, and that your system, how your team communicates really defines how your team executes on the ground. The better the collaboration structure that you have between an autonomous team that's aligned to some business goal, the better outcomes you're going to get. And this is counterintuitive, and it kind of goes against Conway's law. It goes against some of the things that you see in big organizations where we tend to couple our organizations to the designs and the software systems that we're trying to build, right? So using Conway's law as a design principle, if you structure teams around the systems that you want, not the one that you default to, you gain alignment by design. When product boundaries, team boundaries, and system interfaces line up, you're going to get better velocity and better clarity. This is important to think about also in the context of Dunbar's number, right? When we talk about we like small teams, coordination breaks down past about 150 people, according to Dunbar's number, but many teams find that effectiveness starts to drop at a much smaller size, between 8 and 10, where tight collaboration and shared context are much easier to maintain. Studies such as Hackman's work on team effectiveness and research from MIT's Human Dynamics Lab show that smaller teams tend to perform better due to higher communication density, faster decision making, and stronger trust dynamics. Again, I'm reading from my notes here, but all of this are supporting points around how you design these smaller, more product aligned teams, right? And in big organizations, oftentimes you'll see that teams are structured just top down tiered, right? You have engineering managers. Those engineering managers have teams that align to some features or some baseline set of software systems. In microservice architectures, you'll typically find one team per microservice design. That's very normal, and again follows along with with Conway's law. I think you find that is probably the most atomic design that you can find is one service designed per, and then one team owns that service. But we've seen things work out better if you align teams more to the business goals that you're trying to achieve. So, for example, we like using right size services here, and we've done this many times for other companies. You can go to microservices from right size services, right? Microservices is the logical ending of every single service, right size service being its own bounded context. But at the end of the day, you want to align your teams towards how they deliver against business outcomes. If you want to do that, then your organization needs to be aligned as such, right? We like to build full stack product teams where you have some number of engineers that understand front end and back end. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to only have full stack humans on the team. I've gone on records talking about full stack. It's very difficult to do full stack well. It's really hard to be a great Golang programmer and a great React programmer. Are there people that can do it? Yes, absolutely. There are plenty of them. But it's difficult and it takes a lot of extra work and it takes a lot of context and it takes a lot of understanding across that. Or if you work in something like Rails or Laravel or some framework that is designed to be full stack from top to bottom, then it's a little bit less of a challenge. But we build full stack teams where you have front and back end people that work on the same team that are aligned to target work streams that have some business value on a current client. For example, we had excuse me. On a current client, we had, for example, a timesheets feature that needed to be implemented inside their software system. And we had a team that worked against that particular business goal. And there were multiple systems that had to be touched. It wasn't just one service, it wasn't just one UI, it was multiple places, multiple databases, and migrations had to be built. So the team was able to operate against every single concern top to bottom in that particular feature. And the outcome was great because we could deploy that particular feature out to the UI with feature flags, and the back end had feature flags, et cetera, et cetera. So it allows you to build business value and have teams work against work streams that align back to what product is looking to do. Another important thing to think about when you have small teams is that decision velocity is very fast. What is decision velocity? It's a measurement of how quickly a team can make decisions. It's the agility of the team, frankly. Smaller, well-structured teams typically make faster and more confident decisions, especially when context is shared and the systems are supported. So these things together, right? All of these ideas are facets of a good team and how you can design a small tribal crew that can execute against big objectives in alignment to the organization's broader broader design. Let me grab some water here. I have a tickle in my throat. My kids brought home something. Who knows what it is, right? So what happens when we sort of lose sight of some of these pieces when teams are unsupported and not aligned? Typically, autonomy without clarity leads to developer anarchy, and this is some big anti-patterns in organizations that you'll see. Oftentimes, when you have developer anarchy, there are small teams that are doing whatever they want. There's a lot of duplication. There's a lot of repeating of certain architectural patterns. People tend to not respect various decisions. And again, there's a very fine line to walk here. I'm not advocating for centralized decisions. I am advocating for organization, though. You can't put three teams on the ground and tell them to go do whatever they want, because there will have to be conversations across those three teams, right? Conway's law. You'll end up with three silos, and those three silos will produce software that will do something, but they may or may not actually be in accordance. They may not be able to be designed well with one another, right? Especially if these teams are not talking to one another without some form of upper level support and upper level clarity. So middle management is extremely important in keeping this alignment, which I would say is probably one of the biggest challenges you have as a middle manager. When systems are unscalable, what I mean by systems is typically your software development lifecycle and your platform teams, and we'll get into a little bit more of this on the next slide. Is developers can lose anywhere from 30 to 50% of their time due to internal friction. That is a Retool 2022 survey. So that is a self-reported survey. Take that with a grain of salt, but it was a good data point that I found anecdotally that if we don't think about how to support engineering teams, they can lose a lot of time due to internal friction. What is internal friction? That is, again, decision velocity breaking down because we have to go to, the ivory tower of architects to get a decision made together. That is a lack of a framework of how to deliver software, which is a thing a platform team is really great at. And among other issues like being able to deliver code into feature branches or however we want to do that via GitHub Flow or whatever our choice is. The more friction that you put into the system, the more productivity that developers lose because we're spinning our wheels against tons and tons of bureaucracy, right? We've run into this in various customers and also in our own travels prior to this company, where things like having to build out shared environments is a big problem. Now, again, this isn't a problem in every organization. Slack does this. I think they have a shared environments, or at least individual environments in Amazon that people can spin up and use however they need to. So it's not that that's a bad thing. It's that how the bureaucracy around it and how teams can deliver against value is the challenge there. Because if it takes me 2 hours to spin up my own environment, it's very hard for me to deliver an outcome because of the amount of friction that's been put in place there. And that's where platform teams can help by developing again those roads to production that are clear. Um, and when outcomes are untracked, our engineering becomes reactive and not strategic. What that means is that if we're only looking at things like velocity with respect to ticket counts or story points or however we think about it, then we only care about those things, right? It's a big anti-pattern that I see is when teams optimize for what's visible instead of what matters. What do I mean by that? We only care about the number of points that we push through a sprint because that's what we're being held to, right? Going back to Goodhart's law and the metrics, right? Um, Teams will optimize for this. A team on the ground that's being held to a 20-point sprint commit will optimize to the 20-point sprint commit, and they will make sure that they hit their 20 points because nobody wants to fail, right? What this means is that we'll do things like, taking partial points or whatever. And these are all things that I see and I still see in the wild. And again, no shade. It is a thing. And if that's in the system you're in, if you're in safe or whatever, that's what you have to do. But I've typically not seen that produce any good outcomes apart from playing games to meet the numbers that we're supposed to meet. Instead of thinking about what is actually important and what matters, right? We get caught up in the thought of, am I hitting my points, and not, am I delivering this feature that provides some lift or some value back to the organization at large. So how do we get through this? How do we build a team that's effective, right? And I'm going to spend some time here is, again, building tribes and not teams. So what is a tribe versus a team? A lot of the FANG companies, the Facebook, Google, Netflix, Apple, all those companies, they don't use these traditional SDLCs that you see in enterprise. Now, again, there were pockets of Microsoft when I was there that was using things like Scrum and Agile. But for the most part, when I was at Danger and when I was at, Silicon Valley, been at Silicon Valley type approach product companies, you don't really see them following the traditional SDLC, the sort of agile Scrum stuff that you see out there in the wild at like the big enterprises, the billion-dollar enterprises. And I don't think that that's by accident. I think that these companies, they do have a little bit more autonomy over how their products are built. So there's not quite as large of a need of organizing certain pieces of that of the delivery stream against others, because again, pieces of Google will just operate and execute on whatever they need to do given their product charter. At least when I was having a chat with some of my friends that worked there a year or two ago, this is what they did. So they could have changed it by now. Whereas if you work at like a Home Depot or a Lowe's or some other big company, there's a need for having broader strategic coordination across your various pieces, because you're building store operation systems. You're building an operating system that supports, 3,000 stores across the United States. So that's a different model and a different problem to solve than what a Google or a Facebook would have. Although I would argue Facebook and some other more integrated companies possibly have the same problem. But the focus on small product aligned units with embedded metrics in each of those teams is one of the bigger advantages that I see in these big companies, in these FANG, more technology focused companies. And these embedded metrics, they can be anything from OKRs to product delivery notes. One of my good friends worked on Google Stadia back when it was a thing, and he ran his teams in this way, such that we have deliveries and we have deadlines that are tied back to revenue, OKRs, and KPIs that the product team is looking to meet, so that we can continue to move the product forward and keep getting funding. So they operated again similarly as a small business, trying to deliver value into the market. And I think there's something to be learned there, right? As a big company, if you spend all of your time just thinking about your cross-functional requirements and your support across multiple pieces, you're kind of missing out on a key component of R&D and revenue generation that might get you a leg up on your competition. And just thinking outside of the box, right? We have these giant store systems, operation systems, whatever we're trying to do, but we also need to be thinking about how do we empower these smaller crews to get more things done, and building out the communication structure. Again, going back to Conway's law, right? If you focus on asking folks to build systems that are embedded and cross-functional, then via Conway's law, it will be a feature. You will now have a software system that's developed and that's built in a way that is reusable and is something that you can rubber stamp out across your organization, where you have X teams that are all talking to one another. And again, this is fair unicorn fairyland, perfect land. It won't actually work out this way in practice, but if you try, you'll get some of the good components of this, and you'll see your team starting to deliver more against business outcomes and less against strategic, sprint metrics. Um, One big piece of this, I think, is support by paving the road to production with proficient platform teams. DevOps, y'all remember 5 or 10 years ago, DevOps was the big thing. DevOps has sort of logically evolved into platform teams, and there are plenty of people that still call them DevOps teams, and they're entire organizations that are dedicated to DevOps. And I think DevOps is great. It's a thing that needed to happen, right? Agile as applied to operations, but I think as cloud native becomes more of a thing, and even if you're looking at OpenShift, if you're building out your own data center and still running something like OpenShift, where you have your own sort of cloud-esque type things that you can run in your own rented data center, it solves a bunch of these harder problems of how do I get software into production without bottlenecking, right? Infrastructure teams are notorious for being bottlenecks. Don't have a problem with that in highly regulated environments. But if you are a small business, or if you are trying to get value into the market before one of your biggest competitors, you're hamstringing yourself if you're focusing on DevOps as a vertical tier and not a horizontal integration across all of your existing teams. We like to have our teams develop and deliver into production using their own capabilities. It's not hard to learn how to write Terraform or ARM or Bicep or whatever your target, think CloudFormation, whatever your target infrastructure as code framework, because it's not difficult to learn that. A lot of systems engineering is applied to software, as applied to software can also be applied to infrastructure. Turns out single responsibility principle, load balancing, all those things are stuff that you can understand. Now, if you're in a more complex environment with Kubernetes or K8s or some of the sort of deeper, more difficult to use infrastructure componentry, then yeah, you're going to have some support. Perhaps you embed a DevOps person in every single team, or someone who understands how infrastructure can be deployed. But what you're going to find is that that's not a concern that lasts very long. Once you get your Terraform written, or you get your application architecture understood, and especially if the platform team is providing Terraform modules or some form of ideas around how to deliver, not again being super prescriptive, but helping folks understand if it's an API, it's load balanced and it's stateless, and here are the reasons why, and here's the things you need to do. Then you're accelerating your application teams by orders of magnitude. They should be able to get things out there quickly into staging environments, into lower environments, get them tested, and make sure they work. There are a few caveats to that. Again, databases are still hard. There still needs to be folks that understand how to optimize for certain database concerns, how to run indexes and all that. But at the end of the day, the platform team's job is to pave that road and to hand that over to your application team, so that that tribe can deliver its own software into production without the need for a broader, um, uh, broader, what's the word? Without platform team having to have them, right? Having to call them on the phone and say, hey, I need a server, right? You don't need to do that. You should be able to do that on your own. Um, Moving into middle management, I think it's very important to talk about middle managers as connectors and not controllers. I think this is very well done in a lot of the companies that we've worked with, where engineering management teams are empowered to go and do the things that they need to do. Again, they're not ivory towers. They're not architects that are focusing on you can only, thou shalt and thou shalt not. It's more of, I'm here to connect you to the right person to solve your problem. I'm here to understand how we're moving towards this objective of delivering this feature, this function, this value into production, and focusing on building up the team and encouraging the team towards those things, pointing them back to things like the platform team or the frameworks that we follow, holding the line on standards, ensuring the automated testing is there, working with product to make sure that we're delivering against what product wants, and that is in alignment back to site reliability and all of the performance and optimization challenges that you might have at scale. Um, Again, middle managers are one of the most critical pieces of this. I remember on the previous webinar, we had a stat from McKinsey is that ineffective middle management is cited in 60% of failed digital transformations. So I think it's very important for us to think about how do we enable those managers, create a platform from them to connect all the dots, work together. Again, not building fiefdoms and kingdoms, but instead working across multiple teams and multiple concerns to deliver value against products, initiatives, and against what the stakeholders want. And I think finally, one of the most important things I think is just to talk about durability instead of velocity, right? So velocity is a very one-dimensional metric. It only talks about forward, like how quickly we're heading towards a goal, and I think that's important. You do have to deliver against dates. I'm not. No one's saying that it'll get done when it'll get done. Maybe once upon a time in my career I've said that, but that was a mistake. We have to meet business goals and objectives, right? But durability talks about the sustainability. I'm going to take sustainable pace. I'm going to take it one step further, and I'm going to talk about the durability of a team. So when I say durability, what do I mean? I mean predictability. Code quality is high. Automation is high. We have a quality software development lifecycle. What do I mean by quality? We're delivering against our needs. It's not oppressive. We're not hating our lives, but we're also able to step up and execute when we need to, right? If I need to stand in the gap and spend a little bit of extra time to deliver against something, I will, because I know that my organization has my back, right? I'm being inspired to deliver. I'm being inspired to perform. I'm not being held accountable to underperformance as sort of the rule of law, which sometimes that's what velocity can be seen as. It can be seen as a stick and not a carrot. Now, again, in really good situations and scenarios, this isn't the case, right? Velocity is just a thing we use. We talk about it. We say, yeah, we got 20 points done. Great. That was what our sprint commit was, plus or minus 5%. Who cares? We're all fine. In really great software development life cycles with really great managers, and these systems exist. You may work in one. These are not a problem, but I have also seen them be a problem, especially when you're talking about a more transactional relationship between engineering and the broader organization. And when you have a transactional relationship between engineering and the broader product organization, you will not get tribes. You will simply have people that are ticket takers that exist to fight the system and to build out their ticket and move on with their life. And the challenge with that is that it shifts the focus of the employee away from the accountability structure, which is the team itself, and more to the broader accountability structure of the organization, right, of the company. And that's how you get people really mad at your company really fast, because then they have something to point to, right? The evil corporation is doing this. Whereas if you have a tribe, a group of people that are in it together, that are there to solve problems and to build whatever software comes their way, whatever that may be, that aren't particularly aligned to a specialist domain, but are instead these functional generalists that Martin Fowler wrote about recently, then you get accountability inside the team itself, right? People will hold each other accountable and they will want to go farther together. You'll get mentoring for free. You'll get, again, assuming all these humans are good-willed and want to be a part of that system, right? And that's a hiring practice issue that you have to solve for. But let's just assume for a moment that the entire team wants to deliver against these values. You get mentoring for free, you get accountability for free, and you get a group of people that are a community that want to go and solve problems together instead of a team that this is my job and my 9 to 5 and I clock in and clock out when I'm done. And the more bought in your employees are, the better they're going to deliver against the business needs that you have, right? So when I talk about durability, I'm talking about the ability to react to oppression, right? To react to a specific situation where we have to sit down and maybe work a little bit extra. to get this out the door, right? A tribe won't care about that because a tribe knows that they'll be compensated for it, and they understand that we're all in this together and we're all here to solve this problem together, right? A tribe holds each other accountable to code quality standards, right? Nothing gets slipped under the rug because we all have this standard together that we're moving forward to solve for, right? And again, this is a difficult thing to achieve. This is unicorn fairyland, right? It's a very difficult thing to achieve. But again, these tribes, they have identity, shared purpose, and clarity. And when you have that, you get a lot out of it, right? And Google, Amazon, Spotify, they organize around these durable customer aligned teams. They have autonomy and a support structure, which is a SRE organization or a platform team organization. And the managers, they bridge product and engineering, and they do coaching. They're not just about coordinating. So these are all important ideas, right? If you're building a durable team, you want teams that understand this, and you want teams that are able to lean into these ideas and deliver against what product wants quickly. So let's talk about. I got two really quick case studies here, things that we've done that I want to talk about that are in alignment to this. And I've anonymized both of them just simply to call out that we've seen this work well, right? So, context, one mid-sized healthcare fintech organization needed to rebuild its V0 after multiple failed vendor attempts. They had hired a vendor. The vendor had a team of 12 that was across various competencies, UI, UX, product, etc. We ended up coming in with two engineers and one product owner, replaced that team of 12. We emphasized early architectural clarity, right? The tribe owned the architecture. We also emphasize just-in-time process creation. That's a big thing that we're huge into that here. Which mean what does that mean? When we see a problem that needs a process, we'll put a process in place. You could argue, well, hey, that's going to be short-sighted, and how do you know you're building the right problem? Well, it's the same as developing software. The testing your software will provide general cases, right? The more specific your tests get, the more general your code is going to be able to become, right? So that's an Uncle Bobism. So what I've seen is the more processes you create and the more you refactor those processes, again, you have to commit to that, you will eventually arrive upon a process that's best fit. As opposed to if you see a very small problem and you craft this giant bureaucratic process to solve that very small problem, you're taking a sledgehammer for a thumbtack, then you're going to introduce a ton of waste across the entire organization, and you're not going to have a best fit for that. I would rather underfit than overfit the problem, right? If you have smart people that are empowered, if you have tribes, not teams, people that want to deliver value against production or value against what your product team is looking to do, then you won't need overly burdensome processes. You will only need the bare minimum that will help keep those teams on the rail. And this is where a lot of leaders get really dicey and dodgy. They're like, wait a minute, how I don't know about that, right? How can I trust them? And that's a very valid concern. You have to have extremely good people, extremely good leaders, and you have to trust that even when they make a mistake, as so long as it's not a fatal mistake, that they'll learn from it. Sometimes we get a little bit scared that one mistake is the end of everything, and it's not. Mistakes happen all the time in software engineering. Mistakes happen all the time in process. Mistakes happen all the time in business. And if you hold people to perfection, you'll never actually get anywhere. Perfect is the enemy of good. So our approach is let's go the minimum amount of process possible, and let's put more in place as we go. And we did this at this customer. We started out with very, very light, simple execution where the engineers would develop and deliver an increment and iterate, put it in production. It would get UAT'd by the product owner, and then we'd move on to the next feature, or we'd go backtrack and do some changes. And eventually, as the product became more mature, we had to add more process. We had to add more check valves because now we have a system that's in production that was touching HIPAA data, that was touching financial data. So now we had some frameworks that we were beholden to prior to the V0, right? So again, just-in-time process creation, very, very important. Features were directly aligned to business value, and the team embraced YAGNI. YAGNI means you ain't gonna need it. That is a very important idea that I think is oftentimes ignored in software engineering. We like to over-engineer things over here because we think of, well, what if this happened? What if a meteor fell out of the sky and hit my, software, hit my data center? How would I manage that? And honestly, I think Yagni and following the 80/20 rule is the best approach to most situations like this where you're building a V0. When you have a bigger system, Yagni still very much applies because you probably won't need 80% of what you think you need, which I think is been played out multiple times anecdotally and probably scientifically. I don't have any data on that right now, but I could probably go find some where business teams developed this giant, sort of lofty idea of what we need. And honestly, 20% of that was in fact what the customers actually wanted. And I think it's important to embrace Agni early and often, always question if you actually need that before you go and implement it. That was super helpful in this particular case because we were able to deliver that MVP in 4 months over multiple iterations and a gradual migration for right? We reduced a lot of cost by using leading architecture, native patterns. And that's not sort of a commentary on cloud native, right? Cloud native is great. You can get the same approach in your data center if you, again, think lean as how you're delivering things. List answer is probably the right answer. Occam's razor, right? How do we build out the simplest solution that gets this product out there? You can argue back, well, what happens when that thing scales and you see that you've made a mistake? Very good point. The counter argument to that is ensuring that you've built modular software as you go. If you're using microservices or if you're using right-size services, which is what we like to do, you should be able to peel off and modularize scalability points as you go. Very rarely does a software system go from 0 to 400,000 users per day. It's incredibly rare. Unless you're, again, migrating a big bang migration from point A to point B. And we know that to be very dangerous and something you shouldn't do anyway. So thinking in terms of traffic balancing and how to build out things incrementally was a big plus to this team. They were able to think that through, and a small, super small team, a sixth the size of the previous team, were able to deliver against an MVP in very short order that met the needs of the product organization very quickly. So what do we learn from this? Again, it's not about bodies. It's not about how many people you have. It's about the ideology on the ground. It's about emphasizing early clarity, again, just-in-time process creation, business alignment, and ensuring that the lines of communication between your smaller teams, either each other or your smaller teams in product, are very, very tight, and they can have these sort of deeper conversations about how are we adding business value. So let's talk about the next one here, impact without bloat. This particular product we built and we owned for a little bit. It's called Well Entry. Back in the pandemic, 2020, let me take you back. A little bit of trauma there for me, but going back to 2020, we had a healthcare company that we worked for that needed a high reliability COVID screening solution. This company worked with pediatric nurses that were working with kids with trachs. So it was a big deal to actually have the appropriate paperwork and also to ensure that you didn't do some damage to an at-risk population. So what we ended up doing here is, again, very small, lean team, one UX PO from a sister company, one engineering manager, and then 3 developers. It was a fully cloud native architecture that pivoted twice. So this is a commentary on allowing your teams to be able to pivot their architecture. So we started out with 2 mobile applications and a backend service, and we ended up merging those 2 mobile applications into a single mobile application with a backend service. The backend service didn't have to be changed at all. Because we built it modularly. It was such a small service that we didn't really need any more than one, right? If we had taken the sort of academic architecture approach, there were probably 2 or 3 bounded contexts in this, and that we would have 3 services. We only needed 1 service. And we supported 30,000 caregivers with multiple surveys per day. So we're talking probably 120 to 240,000 messages per day for a service. That's really small, actually, if you think about it, especially since it's a super tiny JSON blob, maybe a kilobyte if you're lucky. So again, thinking in terms of what we needed right now, was the system designed to scale? Absolutely, because we were targeting healthcare systems, we were targeting school systems. Like, we had big dreams for this thing. So we'd done the exercise and decided that the team decided that a small service with a simple front end and a configurable question and survey and answer system was good enough. And turns out it was. We were able to pivot this to a few other customers by the time we were done with it. And that was all due to a little bit of pre-planning, but also focusing on just-in-time process creation and sort of just-in-time software development pivots as needed. We delivered it with no project managers. I don't say that to attack any PMs. Y'all are my friends. I love you guys. But ultimately, we didn't need them here because the PO and the UX person that we worked with kind of did that duty a little bit, but also the team themselves were able to execute on the project without direction because they were given autonomy and said to go solve these problems. And this one team worked on both the front end mobile applications and the back end. There were different people that were more specialized across those two components. There were some people that were very focused on the front end and on the React Native stuff, and there were some folks that were more focused on the back end. But everybody could work across any position in the team. We delivered MVP in 8 weeks that scaled to 30,000 caregivers with multiple surveys, and we scaled it with minimal support staff, and we didn't have any outages at all during feature iteration. And again, these are all just making smart decisions while we were on the ground, empowering the team to act as a tribe and to execute and build things. The team came back to us with lots of ideas and lots of additional things that we needed to put out there, some of which I believe were implemented. There was a back end dashboard alongside the front end for the mobile application. So we provided several reports. There were some reports that were come up from the team that we thought were interesting. And the team supported their own software. So if something was down, they were able to go in and solve that problem. It was put on top of our ECS Terraform modules. So technically a platform team, i.e. myself, because I wrote that module, were able to provide the road to production such that that team very simply could deploy that into production through just simply calling a few simple Terraform modules that were well documented to build that out and get it load balanced. So that tribe mentality was how that team was able to execute and deliver into production working software that served real people. We made real money off of this. It was an actual SaaS product. It was not. It's not imaginary. We did make quite a bit of cash off of this thing before it sunset. Couldn't think of some ways to maybe pivot it, which I kind of wish that we did. But at the end of the day, this was another proving ground for small teams with a tribe mentality are much better than sort of these broader, bigger, bloated organizations. And again, thinking back to Conway's Law, this one team was responsible for every component in the system. And again, maybe that's a little bit of a trivial example. If I'd had 15 teams, perhaps there would be a different conversation. But I honestly think these ideas still map back to that, and we still would have treated the teams the same way. There would just had been a broader communication network across the engineering management structure and how people would work together. And you want to again be very careful of Conway's Law. It can be a bug and a feature. You have to think through how do we align our software, how do we align our teams, how do we design our teams in such a way that they can produce software that is decoupled but also able to be shared and solve shared problems across the organization. So let's kind of wrap it up here. Just like last time, here's some sort of silly check marks for us to go through, some things to think about as you're parsing this information. Are my teams aligned to business domains? And I'm not talking in the terms of microservice bounded context. Are my teams aligned to what I'm trying to accomplish? And does that in turn make Conway's Law a bug or a feature for my organization? Do my platforms remove repeatable toil? This is a big thing for me. And one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of Kubernetes, and throw rocks at me, is it's way too complicated. Again, the simplest deployments of Kubernetes require an inordinate amount of work and Helm charts to get things out. Yes, there are hello world examples where I can put a container into production in 5 seconds, but the broader implications of making your engineering team understand how the infrastructure runs is a problem, because I like to have my engineering teams know how infrastructure runs. I don't want any black boxes. I don't want any surprises. I don't like black boxes. And that's just part of how we run things and how I believe our teams should run, and that DevOps is more of a horizontal aspect and not a vertical aspect. And the platform teams are there to enable that horizontal aspect to make it easier for people to put things into production. Do you measure impact or efforts? I'm sorry, story points are effort. It's not impact. You can correlate story points to impact if you would like, and if you want to go through that. But I've not seen many teams that actually go through that exercise. They simply think of them as effort, right? I got 20 points done, so I'm a 20-point person. I've even heard at some customers, person X produces 3 times the points as the rest of the team. That doesn't mean anything. It can mean something if, again, your points are very strictly metriced by product or very strictly controlled by product. But we all know that the entropy in these points is difficult. It's hard to say that a 5 point story over in this team is the same as a 5 point story in this team. So delivering 3 times the points may or may not mean anything. I don't know for sure, which is why I just remove them, right? Stop thinking about that. Use that if you must, use it as a metric to understand the general workload of the team, but you can just as easily count the number of tickets and get rid of pointing altogether and achieve more or less the same result if we're meeting that fairy unicorn land where all tickets are of equal weight, which is I've never seen done well. Um, are your middle managers enabled to lead and not just buffer? The blocking, I've myself have said I'm a blocker and a tackler, right? I'm blocking and tackling for my team, and I think that that's important to allow folks to do that and allow them to lean into the business problems and the organizational problems, right? Have your middle managers enable them, empower them to solve problems and connect teams together instead of just being a buffer that protects their team or being a buffer that protects the interests of themselves and their fiefdom and or your fiefdom if you're the VP and you have 4 or 5 of these folks. Just focusing again on you can go lead your team, right? We like intent-based leadership. Not everybody does, but I tell my teams, tell me what you intend to do, and I'll tell you if I like it or not. And that sort of approach is great when you have very excellent humans that only want to deliver the best against their leadership. Are you actively designing to counteract this organizational gravity, this idea that our teams and our systems all sort of pull towards outcomes, right? Are we designing our organizations to enable them? Are our teams empowered, right? Are our teams able to activate as tribes? And are you delaying process until it's needed, right? That's my favorite point on this, and something I think that's made us as a company very successful is that we develop and build process just in time. And this is true for architecture, right? This goes back to Uncle Bob and test-driven development, right? Emergent architecture, maybe you've heard of that. Like, we are TDD fans here. We don't use it all the time, but we like the ideas in it. And honestly, you should delay most decisions until you need to make them. Some folks call that lazy. I call it actually very smart, because if there are some decisions that should be made up front, yes, absolutely. There are some decisions that have to be made up front, especially when you're talking compliance and very difficult architectures that have very specific needs. But for your average enterprise, you don't really need to plan 3 quarters ahead, because honestly, your plan's wrong after a week anyway. So focusing on delaying process and delaying planning, I would also argue, until you need to, is something that we've seen that's very valuable to certain organizations that can operate in this way, because some of you can't, obviously. And then finally, I would invite us all to think about what are the key differences between these ideas: autonomy versus chaos, velocity through versus throughput, and scale versus sprawl, right? And the answer is that each one of these autonomy is chaos is the logical end of autonomy without oversight. Throughput is what we care more about than velocity. Velocity is just a simple empty metric. And then scale versus sprawl. Sprawl means you just do it to do it. Scale means you've thought it through. So it's really about the intentionality in each of these ideas, right? Are we intentionally thinking about these things, or are we simply just letting our teams run and then figuring out and reacting to what they're doing? And a lot of enterprises and a lot of companies, they try really hard to plan things, and they focus on lots of high level planning, and they spend tons of time trying to align their organizations, and absolutely kudos, and that's a really good thing to do. But when the rubber meets the road, are your teams able to actually carry out these orders and carry out carry out whatever they need to in order to hit the targets that they have? All right, that's my presentation. Hopefully this was helpful. I think maybe there was some things that didn't make sense that I will clarify in some notes, but overall, I hope everybody understands that the goal is communication, the goal is collaboration, the goal is to have a tribe and not a team, and that's really the focus of how you ensure that your teams are aligned to outcomes. Is that they are empowered to make decisions, they have the appropriate support framework from platform teams, and your middle management is able to drive them towards outcomes as opposed to just worrying about metrics and throughput. So